recorded, so just wanted to let everybody know that, and then it'll be posted later, probably on the TJPDC website. All right, so good evening, everyone who has joined us. My name is Boris Palchik. I'm the project manager for this project. I'm with a company called Foursquare Integrated Transportation Planning, and we are a transit planning consulting firm that was selected as part of a team to do this Albemarle County Transit Expansion Study. The other partner on our team is Michael Baker International. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. If anyone has questions at any point, feel free to press the hand icon, if everyone can see that, and then we'll call on you to call a question, to ask your question. So we'll start with a little bit of background information, starting with the goal of this study. So the goal of the Albemarle County Transit Expansion Study was to identify specifically short-range opportunities to expand transit service and key population. To expand transit service to key population employment centers in Albemarle County. There's another study going on sort of in parallel that's looking at more longer-term, more of a vision approach, but our study was looking at short-range opportunities. So the focus area geographically that we were looking at consisted of three parts, or three specific study areas. One was the US 29 North Corridor between the Charlottesville city limits and approximately the North Fork UVA Discovery Park Ravenna Station area, which is up here. Then the second study area was the Pantops area, which is east of Charlottesville, and then finally the Monticello area south of I-64. So those are the three areas that we were tasked with looking at. When we began the study, we really didn't have any preconceived notions. We had a very open mind, and there were a lot of possible solutions to consider. And in general, there's a lot of different ways that you can operate transit or provide transit in a community. Each of these different ways has its own ideal operating environment, and this graphic here kind of illustrates that. So as you get into a more urban landscape, there's a lot more transit types that you could consider, ranging from commuter service all the way down to like high frequency, high capacity, fixed route transit service. But then as you get less out into the less dense areas, more into suburban or even rural land use, a lot of transit options sort of fall away because they really depend on density for their success. And so as you move into lower density and more automobile oriented areas, you're left with a couple of options really that would be viable. One is commuter type service, and the other is what's called shared mobility. And I'll kind of talk about the shared mobility in a second here. As I mentioned, density is really the key for fixed route transit service. But fixed route transit service also does require a supportive pedestrian environment. And the reason for that is that if you do have fixed route transit service, it means that your bus stops are predefined. So you know where they are. There's poles in the ground with signage, and people are expected to make their way to those bus stops in order to catch the bus. And so you do have to have some pedestrian infrastructure in order to facilitate people making their way to bus stops. So these are two kind of key components: the density and the built environment that can either support or not support fixed route transit service. So in areas that are lower density or that lack the supportive pedestrian infrastructure, rather than fixed route transit service, a different type of transit service that is often more effective is what's called demand response service. So demand response service is transit service that doesn't operate along a fixed route. It doesn't have a fixed schedule. It's more of an on-demand type of model. So the benefit of this type of model is that it has usually a larger capture area because the vehicles aren't committed to just operating along a single corridor. They can stray in a larger area. And also they can meet riders where they are. So that's really important for areas where pedestrian activity is more challenging. If the vehicles can get to the riders themselves, that's a great asset. So the modern iteration of demand response service is called microtransit. So microtransit is an app-based approach, a technology-driven approach to demand response service. It's a service model that's very familiar to anybody who's used Uber or Lyft. It uses the same sort of interface, the same sort of approach to requesting service. Typically, a trip is requested from an app on a personal mobile device, and then vehicles then are dispatched based on that request, and the person making the trip request can see in real time where the vehicle is on the app. Sometimes it pushes instructions out to where you should meet your vehicle if you have to maybe go a block over one way or another to meet the vehicle. But anyway, it's very familiar, very similar to the Uber and Lyft interface, but it has some key differences from Uber and Lyft. One of the key differences is that microtransit typically has a dedicated fleet. That's different than Uber and Lyft, where you have an almost infinite number of people who may be driving Uber and Lyft vehicles. They have a variety of vehicle types that they may be operating. Microtransit is much more consistent, much more predictable because it has a dedicated fleet. The drivers who drive it are consistent as well, so they can be vetted up to the standards of the local transit agency. In terms of background checks, in terms of their knowledge in how to work with people with special needs and with disabilities and so on. So a much more predictable dedicated fleet. Also, microtransit has more predictable and affordable fares typically than Uber and Lyft. The reason for that is that the fares are set by a public entity like a transit agency or a county or city or whoever happens to be sponsoring the service. So Uber and Lyft, you never quite know what the final price of your trip is going to be until the trip is completed, because it's distance-based pricing. There's sometimes surge pricing and the like. So with microtransit service, the fare is much more consistent, much more predictable than Uber and Lyft. And this is a service model that is very versatile. It can be used both as a local circulation type service. Typically, microtransit operates within a zone. So within that zone, whatever that zone happens to be, the service can provide local circulation, for example, from somebody's home to a pharmacy or a grocery store or whatever. Or it can also complement the regional transit network by serving as a feeder to other services, typically other fixed route services. So if, for example, there's a commuter service in the zone, the microtransit can complement it by feeding people to that commuter service. And then also microtransit is a very data-rich platform. So what that means is because all the trips are reserved using an electronic device of some sort, there's usually a call-in option, but even if you're doing the call-in option, somebody kind of on the back end is still entering the trip requests into a database. So all of that information can then be analyzed by planners in order to identify emerging patterns. So for example, if a lot of trips are in a particular corridor, it may make sense over time to make that corridor a fixed route corridor versus instead of microtransit. But it's very data rich, which is very, very useful for planners. So let's see. I see there is already something in the chat. So let's see. Somebody says Matt from Scottsville here. Let's see. Okay. So I think somebody's saying that there's not a lot of density in Scottsville, just 500 people per square mile, but the closest node is 20 miles from Charlottesville. Matt, do you want to elaborate on that comment?
Hello, sir. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hi.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing the data. I was responding to your transect map on the previous slide. I think you've answered it well with the microdensity. That is the solution that is in place in our community now. John provides it at a decent level. Thank you.
Okay, yep, great. And then I see there's a hand up from Caetano.
Hi there. Caetano de Campos Lopez here from the Community Climate Collaborative. I wanted to ask you, talking about microtransit and how it serves a different purpose than fixed route transit and how it's better for lower density areas. Do you have an idea knowing that microtransit is going to have to go to each person's particular, how can I say, place of origin to a final destination that's shared, but you have to go to a particular place of origin. What's the adequate or desirable occupancy levels of the microtransit vehicle? Are we talking about, in ideal operations, they're going to have 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people on board at each time? Is that something that you had taken into consideration yet or not?
So the maximum obviously is based on capacity of the vehicles. Microtransit vehicles typically do have smaller capacities compared to fixed route transit. So this image here shows a few different types of microtransit vehicles that are pretty typical, ranging from what's called a cutaway bus, which is very similar to what Jaunt operates for their type of services, to a kind of like a minivan style vehicle, even all the way down to in very urban areas, these sort of souped up golf cart types of vehicles. So the maximum capacity is a function of vehicle type, but you're correct in that microtransit operates sort of, person by person. There occasionally could be somebody or a group of people picked up all at once. So maybe, at a senior center or something like that, there may be 3 or 4 people picked up all together. But otherwise, microtransit is a shared ride model. So what that means is that if a person is picked up before they reach their final destination, if there is another trip pickup that's within a reasonable distance from their trip, the vehicle will deviate to pick up the next person before, the next drop off. So there could be at any time, up to 12 or 15 passengers potentially. Usually it's more like 3, 4, 5 people at any given time, but there's a constant on and off because everybody or many people may have different trip origins or destinations, but there may be some convergence of the path that makes sense for 2 or 3 or 4 people. So they may be on a vehicle together for part of their total trip. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So let's see, any other hands? No, I think that's it for the hands. And anything else in chat? Okay, so when we looked at the 3 study areas that I mentioned previously, what we found is that the US 29 North Corridor and the Pantops area, while they are fast growing and destination rich environments, both of those areas, they still are relatively low density and also both fairly automobile oriented. And then the third area that we looked at was the Monticello area. So the Monticello area is a fairly small area in itself. It's really just this, cultural and tourist destination. What we found about it is that currently about 98% of people arrive that are just visitors arrive by car, and the same percentage, 98% of employees are arriving by car. And then when asked, would they utilize something other than their personal rented vehicle, only 6% of visitors said they would be very likely to use transit if offered, and then 8% of employees said they would be very likely. The numbers go up if you just ask if they're likely, which is a more broader kind of category, but it doesn't appear that people are clamoring really at the moment for transit service to Monticello, but there are opportunities that I'll mention later to include that in a transit service. Okay, Caetano asks if microtransit operates with less than 15 riders, most often will that impact the decision of the vehicle choice? So the vehicles, this is sort of a preview. I don't want to ruin the ending, but the vehicles for this service have already been ordered. So they are the cutaway type vehicles, which are similar to what Jaunt has. So they, I believe, have somewhere in the neighborhood of 15, maybe 17 passenger seated capacities, I believe, maybe even up to 20, because those types of vehicles come in different lengths as well. But that's the type of vehicle, the cutaway vehicles that we would expect in this area. Okay, so what we did in our study is for each of the 3 study areas, we developed 2 service scenarios. And the 2 service scenarios included a mix of fixed route and microtransit options. The scenarios were presented back in October at a series of public and stakeholder meetings. And they were also posted on the project website. 39 people participated in the public and stakeholder meetings. We requested the participants, as well as anybody reading the plan or reading about the scenarios online, to participate in a survey. So we had nearly 160 surveys submitted, and the surveys were asking for people's preferences among the 2 scenarios and the elements of the scenarios. So what we saw from the surveys is that the meeting attendees and the survey participants had a very strong interest as well as a preference in microtransit service for all 3 study areas. A couple of examples of quotes that people provided. Somebody said, "I think microtransit would be more helpful for those with mobility concerns who find it difficult to get to a bus stop and who want reliable service for appointments." Somebody else said, "Microtransit makes sense for shopping centers where rider demand probably varies considerably by time of day." These 2 graphs here, these are from a survey that Monticello did themselves, kind of internally. They surveyed visitors and they surveyed their own staff. And among the staff, we asked people, or they asked people, if they were comfortable with using an app for transit service or an app-based transit service. 89% said yes, and then among Monticello visitors, 85% said yes. So overall, however we asked the question, however we presented it, whether it was fixed route versus microtransit or less microtransit versus more microtransit, generally people tended to come out on the side of yes microtransit and as much of it as possible. So for example, in the US 29 corridor, we had 2 service scenarios. One scenario had a smaller microtransit zone, and the other had a larger microtransit zone. So the preference was the larger microtransit zone. So that was scenario number 2. When we asked whether in the Pantops area if people preferred microtransit or an expansion of fixed route service, basically adding an additional route. There's currently 1 route in the Pantops area. One of the scenarios had an addition of a second route. People overwhelmingly, 63%, said they preferred the scenario with microtransit in the mix. And then finally, for Monticello, same thing. We had an option of a fixed route connection from Monticello to PBCC, where people could connect to the CAT system. We had another scenario where we recommended a microtransit zone covering not just Monticello, but also PBCC and residential neighborhoods south of I-64 that are kind of difficult to serve with fixed route service for a number of reasons, mostly because of land use. And again, there, 67% preferred the microtransit scenario to the fixed route connection. So the theme overall was a strong support for microtransit service. And so our recommendations, which we're going to go through now area by area, are also focused heavily on microtransit service. So first, in the 29 North corridor, the recommendation is to set up a microtransit pilot project within a zone that's approximately 14 square miles. This area is entirely within the urbanized area, the region's urbanized area. That has a significance I'll mention later on, but just keep that in mind that it's within the urbanized area of Charlottesville and Albemarle County. It's a growing area with approximately 15,000 people and more than 6,000 jobs. The estimate that we have for initial ridership for this microtransit zone is 75 people per weekday initially, but the ridership potential could grow up to 360 passenger trips a day over time. So that's kind of to give you a sense. Typically, ridership does start out quite slowly because people aren't familiar with this service model, so it takes some education, some promotion, and so on. So we expect a pretty modest ridership initially, but then it could grow quite substantially over time. So the parameters of the service that we're recommending are weekday only service for approximately 15 hours of service a day using 3 vehicles. So 3 vehicles, what that means is there would be 3 microtransit vehicles kind of roaming this zone. And the reason you want multiple vehicles is because the more vehicles you have, the shorter the wait time is from when a person requests a trip to when the vehicle finally arrives. So with 3 vehicles, the estimated median wait time is approximately 15 minutes within this zone. The operating cost of the service would be approximately $1.32 million annually. That includes two main components: the vehicle operating cost itself. So that's driven by salaries and benefits of the drivers, as well as fuel costs and the like. And then the second component is the platform or software fees that go along with making it operate as a microtransit versus like a traditional dial-a-ride or demand response service. So since the service is entirely within the urbanized area of the region, we are recommending that the service be operated by and branded as CAT, because CAT has traditionally been the urban operator in this region, with John providing more of the rural and exurban type of service. And so CAT would also be the grant applicant that that would apply for the grant for funding for this pilot project, and we'll talk about that grant application a bit later on. Any questions about the US 29 corridor? Okay, so moving on to the Pantops area. Here we have a much smaller zone, so it's only 2 square miles compared to, I think, 14 is what I said for the other one. A zone that small could operate with a single vehicle, but for microtransit service, the rule of thumb is that you never want to operate with just one vehicle, because one of the benefits of the technology that's behind microtransit service is that it can smartly determine which vehicle to dispatch to which trip request, so that it can group trips, so that it can improve both the directness of service, but also the productivity of the service by grouping trips with similar origins and destinations. If you only have one vehicle, you can't really take advantage of that element of the algorithms that are inherent to the software that sort of is the platform for microtransit service. And so the solution is, if you have a zone this small, and if there's another zone that's fairly close by, and in this case there is, this little hash mark here, that's the southern tip of the 29 North corridor that I talked about previously. They're not adjacent, but they're fairly close together. And so the 29 North corridor has 3 vehicles assigned to it, and this one has just 1, but you could assign one of the 3 vehicles in the 29 North corridor to be a shared vehicle between these 2 zones. So most likely it would primarily operate in the 29 North corridor, but if it makes sense to dispatch it for a trip in the Pantops area, it could operate within this zone instead. So there would be 1 dedicated vehicle and 1 shared vehicle, and that would allow for 15-minute median wait times in the Pantops area. The estimated operating cost for this zone, for this pilot project, is $432,500 annually. Again, that includes the vehicle operating costs and the software fees. And again, this is within the urbanized area of the region, so CAT makes the most sense as the operator and the brand for the service. The third area we looked at was Monticello, as I mentioned. So in Monticello, what we did quickly realize is that if we look at just Monticello alone, which is this dotted line here, the utility of a transit service, especially a microtransit service, would be very limited, because you don't have the ability to have kind of a mixed use scenario. So in other words, microtransit works best when you have a good mix of land use types. So if you have residential, retail, commercial, tourist destinations, educational facilities, medical facilities, if you have a good mix, then that improves the ridership potential, because It just creates more opportunities for trips to generate. And so we realized that the utility was fairly limited to just focusing on Monticello. So instead, we proposed a larger zone that includes Monticello and includes the Monticello Visitor Center, but it also includes the James Madison's Highland estate. It also includes the PBCC campus, some smaller retail, and then a number of residential neighborhoods south of I-64 that are fairly difficult to serve effectively with fixed route service because of the land use, because of the roadway network and so on. It's just very auto oriented, and it's much more conducive to a microtransit model than a fixed route model. So this is the zone that's proposed for the Monticello area. However, we're recommending that this service be moved to the long term rather than a short term recommendation for a few different reasons. One is that this zone would require 2 vehicles to maintain reasonable pickup and wait times. There aren't currently 2 vehicles budgeted or even programmed for the service providers in the area. So lacking those 2 vehicles, we don't have the resources to implement this in the short term. CAT recently put in an order for 4 transit vehicles, 4 smaller transit vehicles, the cutaway type vehicles that Jaunt operates. They have 4 of those vehicles on order. When they ordered them, they weren't quite sure exactly what service they would put them on, but microtransit makes a really good candidate for those vehicles. And so those vehicles would allow the implementation of the 29 North and Pantops services simultaneously. And so that's why this service is being kind of pushed out to the long term, because the 4 vehicles on order are exactly the amount needed to launch the other 2 zones. Question, what would it mean to include the town of Scottsville in long-term zone 2? So with microtransit service, the larger the zone gets, the longer the average trips are. And in order to ensure a reasonable wait time, you sort of need to do one of two things. You either have to have a more manageable zone size, or you have to have more vehicles in service in a larger zone. So in order to add any areas like Scottsville, for example, it would have to, we need to do sort of an analysis of that, but more vehicles would likely be necessary than, for example, the 4 that we have on order, or these additional 2 that I mentioned for this zone. But I think that these are pilot projects, or at least the 29 North and Pantops ones. And so pilot projects are useful because they are kind of a proof of concept. I think if they go well, then other areas would certainly be interested and could be candidates for the same service model in the future when resources become available. Okay, so now we'll talk about how we get to the implementation phase from planning to implementation. So the first thing we'll talk about is costs. So we look 2 years out because there's an opportunity to apply for a grant with DRPT. That's the Division of Rail and Public Transit for Virginia, for the Commonwealth of Virginia. So we look 2 years out. And I do see, Kitano, I see your hand up, so I'll come back to you in just a minute. But the costs associated with these services are, first of all, there's kind of a setup fee, a service setup fee for microtransit service in order to kind of acquire the platform to make a service into microtransit service. That's approximately $50,000. It's a one-time cost. Then the operating costs, they're broken out here by area. So you have Pantops operating costs, Pantops software fees, and then you have 29 North operating costs and 29 North software fees. So the operating cost refers to how much does it cost to operate a transit vehicle. The going rate is approximately $100 per hour. That covers, like I said, things like salaries, benefits, fuel, insurance, all that kind of stuff. So that translates to about $100 an hour. That's consistent with what Jaunt and CAT currently have in terms of their operating costs. So with the Pantops area, we're talking about a single vehicle. So that the operating cost is $425,000 annually. Then on top of that, you have the software fee, which is about $7,500 for one vehicle. The software fee typically is approximately $600 per vehicle per month. So the total amount of the software and the operating cost for just Pantops is $432,500. Same basic calculations for 29 North, but there's 3 vehicles versus 1, so the cost is just inherently higher. So the 29 North cost is approximately 1.3 million. On top of that, we put in advertising, budget for advertising, so more in the first year than in the second, but this is really critical to growing the ridership from that initial 75 people or so per day per zone to more like 200 or so, or even up to 300 per passenger trips per zone. So overall, first year cost is approximately 1.9 million. Second year cost is a bit less because of the startup fee is only in the first year. So that's the cost, and I'll pause here for a second and answer. Kitano, you have a comment or question? I think you're muted.
Hi, yes, thank you so much, Boris. I have a question that I dropped in the chat, but I will complement it, and if you want, I can write it so it's easier for you to go back to my question. So I'm having a hard time trying to understand how the project try to find the best solution for our community, which, by the way, I like the solution that you're promoting. I think that it aligns with lots of the desires of our community. But the hard time that I'm trying to understand is, so it seems that you had a number of vehicles which are with a certain size and a certain technology that you already knew that were being purchased, that now you're trying to allocate them smartly, efficiently around the areas that you have been working with, and not otherwise, not as coming up with a possible suggestion of technology, size, and number of vehicles, right? And if that's the case, could you share a little bit more about that? And then, if you want to start answering right now, so I don't go back, could you please go and read the questions that I have in the chat afterwards and answer it. One last thing, I've been talking about that with another person about microtransit, and we were very excited by the fact that perhaps microtransit vehicles, smaller ones, would not require special permits for drivers to drive, and therefore increase the possibility of having drivers available. We face nationwide, but here as well, a shortage, quote unquote, of drivers for buses, and I don't know if it has been considered. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so for your first question, were the vehicles predetermined? And the answer is no, actually. So when we started the process, the study, we didn't know about about CAT's plans to procure those smaller vehicles that I mentioned. When we developed the recommendations, our next step was to try to identify who would be the recommended agency to operate the service, and the choices were CAT or Jaunt, or it could be a third party, kind of a contracted service to some third party. That's when we learned that CAT already had appropriate vehicles on order. So CAT was planning to order these vehicles, and their plans didn't quite have fleshed out what they would apply those vehicles for. They kind of had in their mind that they probably need to have a more diverse fleet rather than just the 40 passenger vehicles, in part because COVID has had an impact on ridership, and the large vehicles may not be appropriate even for fixed route service. So they went ahead and started the process of procuring the smaller vehicles. But then it so happened that we were working on this project, and microtransit was the way we were leaning with our recommendations, and so it worked out well. That wasn't the only reason we recommended CAT. The other reason is that as I mentioned, these zones are within the urbanized area, and so that is traditionally CAT's service area. But it's the combination of the service, the urbanized area, plus the fact that they had vehicles available that made them a good candidate. So does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. So I guess my other questions were related to if you could. So right now, knowing that the vehicles were decided, my questions might not make much sense. But I was asking about knowing that the vehicles are going to be larger than what they could have been because of the usage of 3 to 5 riders usually per vehicle, that there's going to be a challenge. I must be clear to meet air pollution and climate pollution reductions on a passenger basis. Because the larger the vehicle is, the higher you need to be the average occupancy of the vehicle to actually be better than a small car driven by one person or two people on board. So in base of that, I wanted to know if you have recommendations or have an estimation of what's going to be actually the environmental and climate benefits, if at all, of that project, and if to mitigate that, you would propose cleaner technologies for the vehicles used by that transit suggestion.
Yeah.
But it seemed that the vehicles were already chosen, so it's kind of difficult to provide a feedback or a yeah.
Yeah. Well, so a few things. So number one, the more ridership grows, the more per passenger impact sort of declines for the service. So if we have 4 to 8 passengers on a vehicle at a given time, obviously the environmental impact per person is less than if we have 1 or 2 people on a vehicle at a given time. So microtransit in general has a capacity to carry usually up to 8 passengers per hour, or to complete 8 passenger trips per hour. Like that could be all the people are on the on board at a given time, or it could be kind of a turnover of some people on at one time, other people at another time. In rare cases, microtransit can carry even more than that, but typically that's only on a college campus type of environment. Some universities are also implementing microtransit service. I think actually UVA has plans to do that as well in the near future. So the more ridership we can get, the stronger the environmental impact is of the service. Microtransit in general is it's a technology neutral model in the sense of what sort of vehicle fueling source do you use. You could have electric vehicles in microtransit service. That's feasible, as long as you had decent enough range to support 8 or 16 hours of service for the vehicle, depending on shift changes and things like that. So there are more and more vehicles coming on the market that do allow the range for transit operations. I think that's not going to happen in this procurement process most likely, but it could happen in the next one. So these are pilot projects. If the pilot project is successful, then future expansions of this service model could include electric vehicles. Okay, the vehicle occupancy level is the key. Total ridership doesn't guarantee lower environmental impacts if occupancy is low. Yeah, again, so that's, you see here we have an advertising budget assumed, and that is to help spread the word about the service, to improve the productivity of the service and have more passengers on the vehicle at any given time. So, all right. Next slide is kind of a calendar of events. So CAT did submit a grant application to the state on February 1st. So the grant application is in already. The grant would be awarded, if it is awarded for this project, it would be awarded by July 1st. The grant would be enough to cover 80% of the cost of the first year of service. So we know that the first year was $190 1.94 million. Albemarle County would cover 20% of that, and the grant would cover 80% of that. That's in year 1. In year 2, there hasn't yet been an identified funding source, so the county would be the one that would be responsible for the funding. However, there are ways to offset the impact to the county. So the most obvious way is through fares. So fares would help reduce the amount that the county themselves would have to pay, because it would, create an offset. Other potential funding sources could be advertising, could be sponsorship, could be other grants other than the DRPT Transit Demonstration Project grant, which is the one that has kind of the highest likelihood of success for year 1. The grant itself would fund 1 year of service, but the grant period can be for up to 18 months. So what that means is, let's say service began in January of 2023. So the first year of service would be January to December. You could start spending down part of the grant even before that for things like advertising expenses, and for things like vehicle procurement and preparation and all those kind of things. So it's an 18-month period, but would only fund 1 year of actual service. So the questions we have, the bigger the vehicle is, the higher is the need for a bigger occupancy level. Yes, so we might be back. Okay, so yeah, I mean, a bigger vehicle is more heavy and does have a more bigger environmental footprint. So these microtransit vehicles they're not the smallest vehicles that would be appropriate, but they're not the largest transit vehicles either. They're not 40-foot buses. They are smaller, lighter, what's called cutaway buses, or body on chassis type of buses. So they're like mid-range in terms of weight and environmental impact. Okay, so Matt saying that he's serious about the town's buy-in. It's a good deal, and we're not in love with the current John service. What would it take? Perhaps we should follow up offline soon. So John has been a stakeholder in this process, so they are aware of this pilot project. So I think that ultimately the success of these first 2 zones will probably have a pretty major impact on how widely this model spreads in the Charlottesville-Albemarle County region. So I think, the key to success initially is being able to secure the grant funding. So we're half the way there. We've submitted the grant. We're just waiting now to be awarded, hopefully. And then part 2 is to spread the word and to ensure that the service is well utilized, because then I think the talk of expanding into other areas would really have a lot more weight. So that is actually the end of the presentation. So if there are any questions that haven't already been answered, I'd be happy to take them. Okay. So if not, I'll just remind everybody that the presentation was recorded and that it will be posted to the TJPDC website. That's right. It'll be embedded in the project site, which will then be linked to the TJPDC site, but it'll be on there within the next couple of days, so you can take another look at it yourselves and share it with others. Question, what's the fuel tech of the new vehicles? So I believe that the vehicle, I can't say with 100% certainty, but I believe that they are either, regular unleaded or maybe hybrid unleaded, but they're not diesel. So I can tell you that. And I don't believe they're electric yet. The cost the cost of electric vehicles right now is coming down, but is still substantially higher than other fuel sources at the moment. I think that'll change within the next 10 years, but at the moment, the electric vehicles are somewhat more expensive. Matt?
Hey guys, I feel like I'm tuning into this really late, and if I missed important opportunities to be involved on the town's behalf, I very sincerely apologize. Too many meetings and too many things going on, stressing small town staff and stakeholders. It's I don't know, strangely heartbreaking that I see Wood and Jessica and Lucinda on there, and I know you guys, and to get this far along without asking us whether we want to play, drafting the grant application, getting this far with the project proposal. I mean, part of my job is to represent commuters who go to jobs in Charlottesville, seniors who don't have cars, they're income restricted at the apartments here, they need to get to medical appointments. I have ridden Jaunt and combined it with CAT and UVA shuttles to get to doctor's appointments when I need it. We got a hard time using public transit down here, but we want to, and folks need it. We really want to be involved, and it hurts to have gotten this far along without being asked whether we wanted to be involved.
Yeah. I'll address that partly. I think maybe Lucinda or somebody could take it as well. But this project specifically was focused on 3 study areas. Even before we began our work, the consultants began our work, we were asked to look at 3 specific areas. Those were determined by the Regional Transit Partnership, I believe. If that's not, I believe that's right, Lucinda. Those 3 areas were initially.
Yeah, Jessica might know better than I do, but I think it was the Albemarle County officials who requested the study. So it was, yeah, the study areas were predetermined by that. So unfortunately, this study didn't expand out to any other areas. However, we can talk offline about helping you guys find some services that work for your area.
Lucinda and Horace, if I could just jump in, this is Jessica. Yeah, these 3 study areas were determined back in like December of 2018 when we put in the application. So that was coming from Albemarle County and CHIP at the time. So yeah, this was a long time in the making. It's not that you're just like coming in and we neglected Scottsville up to this point. It's that those 3 study areas were determined a long time ago.
Okay. I see there's maybe Kitano, you have your hand up?
Hi, it's me. I would like to share something. No, quickly, I would like to understand if how final is the study in terms of would some decisions still be able to be changed by supervisors, or how likely is that? And I'm asking that because, for example, the idea of connecting folks from the different areas to a particular destination hub, quote unquote. I wanted to know if it's your set in where this hub would be, and if it's only going to be one hub, so from all around an area to one hub, or it can have a flexibility of having more than one hub, maybe. Yeah, so pretty much that, because the idea is that you're connecting folks from different from neighborhoods they are to the CAT system, right? You're not necessarily bringing them to their final destination. It's just connecting them to the CAT system, and that definitely could have different values if you are bringing me to a certain route, or if you're connecting me to another route. So would there be a margin for that? What do you think is the process related to it?
Okay, so as far as the final implementation, we got to the process that we were working toward is being able to submit a grant application to DRPT. So the grant application needs to have a service plan. So this is the service plan that we included in that grant application. If it's successful, then there may be some opportunities kind of on the margins to change the zone boundaries and things like that, with sort of final fine tuning. I don't think there would be I don't think there's an opportunity with the grant funding for a dramatically different service. But that's not to say that there wouldn't be other opportunities in the future to change the service, past the grant period or expand even further to other areas. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Matt, there's a message for you from Jessica in the chat, and hopefully you saw that. There's her contact information to continue the discussion about Scottsville.
Thank you.
Okay. If there are no further questions, then I think we're about ready to wrap up. All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in and your interest in this study. So we look forward to hearing about the grant award in the next few months, and then hopefully implementing this service or seeing it implemented. So thank you all. Good night.